Welcome to All Things Work. I'm your host, Ann Sparacco. For this episode, we're recording at SHRM 25, our annual conference here in sunny San Diego. Today, we're focusing on pay transparency, the trends, the trade-offs, and of course, lots of practical tips for implementation. So joining us to talk about this topic are two leaders from C3 Nonprofit Consulting Group, Managing Principal Nancy Hibschman and Principal Amanda Wethington. Welcome to All Things Work, Amanda and Nancy.
Thanks,
Thank
Anne.
you.
So in your session at SHRM 25, you've mentioned that pay transparency is no longer optional. Can you walk us through why that is?
I think it's everywhere right now, right? There's kind of two things. There's the legislative side of it where depending on what state or municipality you're in, you have to comply, right? There's some legislation. But the other piece is there's a lot more access to information. And so employees have this data at their fingertips, whether the employers are providing it to them about what's happening in their own companies, or if they can go out on publicly available information sites to gather that as well. And so I think it's no longer optional because questions are getting asked around it. And it's more than just compliance or checking the box. It's really thinking about what's your compensation strategy? How are you going to approach this? And we'll talk about it today. And so really getting into what you value.
Well, and I think too, I mean, it's everywhere, right? Pre-pandemic, when everybody was basically squarely in office and your talent markets were pretty local, it was one thing. But since that time, we've become remote in nature or hybrid. The talent markets have vastly opened up. So an employer in LA can now hire somebody in New York. So pay transparency might be in California and New York, but if you're hiring in other states, those employees are going to have access to pay ranges and other kinds of information from across the country. So it's really applicable to everybody now.
Yeah, so we're seeing these kind of social trends, like you said, following the pandemic, some legislative changes, really shifting this mindset, right?
I think it's shifting the mindset to something that has been a bit more like in-house, right? Or the employer had a process to it becoming a topic that is becoming a more general conversation also, or that employees are, there used to be, this was kind of sacred, right? You didn't
Right.
talk about pay, right? And that's long gone, right? Whether you share your own pay or not, there's a lot more curiosity, there's a
There
lot more
is.
knowledge, and there's, quite frankly, a lot more organizations that are embracing this to then have a way to educate and talk about this and help kind of build that culture.
Well, and we always talk about like why is pay transparency hard, or like why don't more organizations do it? And it's really interesting. If you talk to anybody, they would tell you that, well, it's not that it's a bad idea. It's just that it's hard to do if you don't have your house in order. If you're not set up to answer all the questions that come with being open about your pay ranges, for example, being transparent about that gets really difficult. But most leaders, managers, employees would tell you that it would sure make things a lot easier if we were all a little bit more open about the what, the how, and the why people are paid.
And that dives kind of into my next question. So we have some SHRM research. We had a pulse survey in February of this year. It found 43% of organizations choose not to share pay band or pay range information with employees. That's a pretty significant number, 43%. So how would you describe the primary trade-offs organizations work through when deciding whether to implement pay transparency with their employees? You touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to dive a little deeper.
Sure. I think I would argue that it isn't a trade-off. I would say that I would say this. It's a trade-off if you're not ready to do it. Then you are giving up a lot. But if you are ready, I think it can make things a heck of a lot easier. And I think it's kind of going back to the what, the how, and the why. The what is, what are you sharing? The how is like, how did you get there? And the why is, why am I paid here in the range? Like those are the things that you have to be able to answer. And a trade-off might be that you could say that you're giving up some flexibility, because if you think about the systems that we have in place today, they're not set up to be transparent. Your traditional pay structures have really wide ranges. We allow you to sort of pay anybody within those ranges, and we do lots of exceptions, whether you're hiring or moving somebody through a range. all that gives you so much flexibility right now that you can understand why we're in this place where we are today, where people are wondering, like, why am I here in the range? Why is somebody else there? And that lots of exceptions have to get made. So I think that rather than a trade-off, transparency is going to help us maybe narrow the ranges, establish some criteria, make it a little bit easier for managers to talk about pay and for employees to ask about it.
I think there's a lot to be said around the alignment. Like Nancy was saying, get your house in order. I think most organizations have some type of system, whether it's communicated or not, or understood, or that managers have the talking points around it as well. But all of these tricky things creep in, like there's been an exception or we negotiated. And so some of this is also about aligning of what do you really say you're going to pay for? And are you holding to that? And one of our principles around all of this is to be unapologetic. Like you have to really put a stake in the ground.
Yeah.
And so that's uncomfortable sometimes.
For a lot of people.
You have to be willing to walk away, right? Or you have to be willing to make a hard decision. And sometimes you've been able to do that behind the scenes, and it's just getting harder to do that as well. So I think it requires more principles around it. So that does require some strategic thinking of how you're going to get there if you're not already there.
And being a little uncomfortable in the process, maybe. Kind
Yeah.
of get comfortable with the discomfort, right?
Yep.
Well, and I was going to add too on the 43% statistic. I think if you would have surveyed 5 years ago, there'd be many more, right? I think there's this trend that many more organizations are becoming transparent in some way, whether you're required to or not. So really most are doing something, but there's a lot of space there to keep evolving.
And that aligns with another data point from that Pulse survey back in February. It found more than a third of about a third of HR professionals think their organization is transparent about how pay decisions are made. So jumping off of that point, how does this affect key talent retention efforts when it comes to maybe employee engagement and morale?
You know, if you think about I thought that was a really interesting statistic. So a third think they're transparent, but so that means 2/3 don't think they're transparent. So it's like, what's sort of in that secret sauce of those that are feeling the transparency? I mean, a lot of the research is showing, and even SHRM research shows this too, which is there's higher levels of engagement. More engaged workforce is a more productive, more profitable workforce. There's less turnover, which costs organizations less to have to replace and train talent. So there's lots of positive things that happen in those environments. And also, if you think about another reason people stay is because they like or entrust their managers. And so that's also a really key thing too. If you can have an open conversation with your manager about your compensation, how wonderful is that? Most of us are terrified to ask about it, and most managers are terrified to talk about it. What transparency offers the culture of an organization is putting all that away. So think about a culture in which you can ask and talk about, and managers have answers and they know the why and the how. You can move the conversation away from what am I paid, or how do I make more money, to how do I start adding more value, and how do I develop, or how can I evolve? So you're replacing the pay conversation with something more important that's a kind of a win-win for both parties.
I think while we're still saying pay transparency is emerging, I think the sophistication around it is emerging. And so there is a lot of energy around comparing salaries, or how to figure out how to talk to your team about pay, or what is known versus what is still unknown. But I think that shift of not keeping it such a secret, right? And really giving, like, managers feel more empowered then to do that, right? And to the point around people stay because of their manager. Like, if you worked in an organization that the culture was much more transparent about that, you actually start talking about it less, because it just becomes known and you don't have to keep trying to figure it out because it's been shared.
And you both touched on, the importance of alignment within the organization. So when an organization is getting ready to introduce kind of this pay transparency, what are some of the best proactive steps they can really take to kick this off in the best way? Because we know that a lot of challenges come with it.
You know, our talk is really based on 3 principles, and we're really committed to this, which is, basically 3 principles. Like, one is do the hard things. Like, don't no one's gonna do pay transparency well without a lot of work. It's very easy if you are required to share your salary ranges to just post those ranges. That's sort of basic. If you're gonna do pay transparency well, you've gotta do some hard things, which is your compensation philosophy. Most compensation philosophies answer the question of how competitive do we want to be against which kind of organizations, and how do we want to deliver that competitiveness. But it now is to answer a fourth question, which is what do we want to pay for? So you've got to do that. You've got to have sound methodology. You've got to your benchmarking has to be in order. That benchmarking has to be applied consistently everywhere. And then so that's like the what. So now you can share your ranges and feel confident that your ranges appropriately represent the market. But now you have to answer other questions. Employees are going to naturally ask, well, okay, so I'm in the first quarter of the range. How come I'm not at the midpoint? Or how come I'm not later in the range? Things like that. And you have to be able to confidently answer those questions. And one tenet we have of this is like, you have to be unapologetic. Like the pay transparency can be very powerful, but you undermine the power of it by being tentative. So I don't know if you wanted to.
I think the third thing is you have to start, right? We're going to talk about this too, and this is part of one of the core tenets in our conversation tomorrow is that you have to get started, and you don't have to do it all at once, but it is here, right? To your earlier question. So yeah, I think get started now. Start figuring out what feels hard, what's holding you back. And start because you don't have to have pay ranges. You don't have to pay for performance. You don't have to pay for somebody's time in the job, but you have to decide what you do want to pay for, right? You don't have to do all of the things, right? But you do have to pick something and then start building your program around that.
She always talks about like the pacing yourself, right? And not in the way that you would think, but it's like the pacing yourself of like, you got to get going, people. You got to go do the hard things, be unapologetic, and then pace yourself, like get going. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that because I think the other thing is the pace of work is changing too. Like compensation and pay has always been kind of on this annual cycle. You get a pay increase once a year. You have an annual performance review process. Maybe you're having more frequent performance conversations, but it's still kind of tied to this like once a year moment or once a year opportunity, right? And jobs are changing faster than that. Like you're doing more collaboration and you're getting more dynamic in the pace of work. And I think this is something that we can maybe talk about later too, is just about the trends of like what's coming, right? I think you're going to have to think about, does your pay cycle still fit within a year? Or do you have to do something more?
I think a big question some people might have, especially in the HR profession, is, how do you address a situation where two people are in the same role paid differently? I mean, we know that this happens. So how would you recommend HR professionals really approach and address this situation? Because it's not easy. Like you said, got to be unapologetic, got to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be okay, right? Like you can have two people paid differently in the same job. But if your philosophy is you pay the same rate for every job, then that's not okay, right? So it's kind of understanding what did you say you're going to value and how is that showing up in what's actually happening in your pay system or your pay structure. If you've got two people paid differently, is it because you have a pay for performance model and one employee has been getting more of an annual increase because of their performance, right? Do you have a way to document or rationalize this? Did you negotiate at time of hire? And is that one of your core tenets that you're allowed to kind of think about how to get the best candidate at all costs, right? And then how do you unpack that if you're going to be transparent? So I think you have to first have your principle, right? You have to do the hard thing and figure out what's our philosophy, what do we want to pay for? And then you have to check yourself if that's what's really happening and how people are getting paid. And if you find that this is a disparity, what's your course to correct it? Or what's your tool to communicate with your managers of like, this is why you have 2 team members that are paid differently, for example. Yeah.
Well, and it goes to having criteria, right? Like it's really about the establishing criteria, and a lot of organizations feel like they've done enough because they have a pay range and they give managers like, here's the range for the job. And they talk about, you talk to any HR person and they will say like, we always encourage our hiring managers or just our managers to pay for the job. But the reality is we have these systems in place that really force you to pay for the person because the construct is so wide and flexible that we really are just paying for the people now, which is why we have issues with pay equity, right? Because there aren't enough guardrails or there's not enough direction to managers of how to do something more equitably. And I'm not saying this is in absolutely every organization, but it's widespread enough as to why we've seen pay equity, pay transparency, all these things evolve to what they are today is because there's been too much flex. So kind of, I think what's happening in the market is that pendulum is kind of trying to swing back to the middle of a balance between flexibility and structure, which is, I think, the sweet spot for being able to successfully be transparent.
Hopefully we can hit that sweet spot.
I hope so. Yes.
And so when it comes, you mentioned, some employees might say, why am I not in the middle of this range? So what type of strategies can HR teams use to evaluate, fair salary placement within, the certain range?
I think there's some objective criteria you could use. So
Okay.
one of the most common ones is time and role. So it's still job-based, but it has this lens of the person as well. So as you've gained more institutional knowledge and you're in the same job, that you'd progress through the pay range, and you can test for that. And some organizations might have a principle to say, we've worked with some that say after 5 years, we'd want candidates or employees in the same job to be paid at our median or at our midpoint or in the middle of our range, right? But you have to have a plan and a budget and a path to do that, because the rate of annual pay increases is typically not enough to pace somebody through a salary range fast enough, right? But you can use other criteria, like the time in a job is just one. It tends to be more objective or less biased. But many like to use past experience or performance, or did were you on a really difficult project assignment, right? Like you have other ways. I think it's about drawing a line about what do you want to reward and recognize also, like in terms of how the person shows up in the job and then what equates to some form of compensation.
And I think too, the pitfalls that organizations face are like, we're going to be transparent. We're going to talk about the ranges, but then they make it very complicated. Like the big problem here is like how do you trust what an organization is doing and how they're setting up their pay structure if someone can't explain it? And over engineering a pay program is not a pathway to success. I mean, it just doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be hard to explain. And it doesn't have to be over engineered. I think keeping it simple, trying to stick to things that are objective, and you're never going to have a totally unbiased approach to how people are paid because we're human beings. So you want to leave it to the machines. I'm sure it could have a very unbiased, but I think if we think about how do you set up an environment where you can remove as much bias as possible and move in the direction of evolution and not perfection, I think that's a recipe for success.
I think that's important too. We talk about ranges and kind of a minimum to a maximum a lot when we think about pay transparency. We have some clients that do only pay for the job, and they've set up other competency-based ways to reward a person over time in the job, but the job is the job. So if you're making $80,000, everybody in that job makes $80,000, right? There's no difference on past experience. So that's another way to approach it. But again, that's going back to having a principle. Like you're going to say we're paying for the job and we're not differentiating based on individual experience. So just different ways to think about it.
Yeah.
And I think quite a few people might be thinking, what are some of the legal and ethical risks of pay transparency, and really how can they help mitigate this? Because we know that there's always a risk when it comes to this. So I'd love your thoughts.
I think with the risk piece of it, we're saying you have to start now, and we're saying pace yourself by getting started, but you still have to be planful around this. And there's a lot of resources of if you're trying to be compliant with legislation, how to
Mhm.
use counsel and how to think about what you're supposed to be doing versus maybe what you're not doing yet. Or what the timeline is. So I think there's some like clear things you can do to check the box on compliance. From a risk standpoint, I also like to think about this as like looking forward. If you're now becoming a more transparent organization and you're now putting in a structure or a strategy that differs from where you've been, you then have to get everybody aligned with where you're going. So it's really more of a forward looking approach as well. And I think that if you're making that transition, um, and you have a fair process around that, I think you can achieve it. Most of our clients that we work with in most organizations don't have this legal risk of inequity in their pay structure at a statistical level. But what it breaks down to is, do people have access to the same opportunities? What does the representation of your workforce look like? Some of the lens of pay transparency is also with pay equity in mind. So I think those are other things just to keep in mind.
So when it comes to introducing pay transparency, there's always a possibility of workplace culture shifts. And it's very important to keep that open dialogue, especially like you talked about, that relationship with your manager is so important. So how would you recommend, managers, workplace leaders, HR professionals really go about managing these potential tensions, maybe even preparing for them?
It's really, you have to lay the foundation. So it has to stem from the organization's core values. So if it's not part of the values fabric of an organization, then it's not going to go anywhere, which means pay transparency and talking about compensation has to start to get embedded in your philosophy around pay. It has to be. And like I said, it's not historically been like a lot of organizations out there don't even have comp philosophies or they don't talk about those. And if you think about this is so generational, right? If you think about like our parents' generation, like talked about nothing. And then I sort of the middle generation is like half one foot in, one foot out. And then the up and coming generations are like, here I am, and I'm going to talk about all of it. So it's bridging all of those different generations that are together in the workforce trying to do the thing.
Right.
And so getting going on that. It's why we keep talking about do the hard things. Like the culture shift has to start with doing some things that are difficult, which is having to define what do we want to pay for. It's a really hard question to answer. And then you have to figure that out. Then you have to figure out how are you going to measure it. And then you have to train people on that. And so it really does start with the leaders, and you've got to get the leadership buy-in. Just like with any other change management, the leadership buy-in is critical. And who are those leaders? They're probably part of that generation that either doesn't like to talk about the things or has one foot in and one foot out. And so that's going to have to be a real mindset shift. But I think if organizations can start to think about the transparency and the discussion around pay as a positive, it's designed to keep the door at HR short. So the reason it's long is because people have a lot of questions, and most of those questions are about pay. And so I think this can be a really good thing, but we have to get everybody ready and adapted to the new way of doing things. And that will require a mindset shift. What would you add?
I think some of the leaders we've worked with that have done this really well bring others along with them also. So it's not just an HR initiative, for example. And there's been many different layers of communication.
Right.
So yes, HR is going to have a lead role in a lot of this because it's involving compensation. But we've been, guests in clients' town halls where everybody's invited to come and ask questions about the program and where there's more sharing of information. There's been manager education sessions. There's executive leaders that are sponsors of this. And you really do have to figure out internally if you've got any detractors, how to help, bridge that gap. Like, what's the understanding? How can they help be a leader? with this messaging as well. So I think the ones that have been really intentional about who they bring along and then different methods of communicating it, because this also goes back to like learning styles, like saying it once. Somebody's gonna be like, great, I saw the pay ranges. I know there's somewhere on our internet. I still don't feel like we're being very transparent about it, right? So figuring out what's going to work for your workforce.
Yeah, everybody needs to be on board with this.
Yes.
I think that's a big part of it, right?
Yeah, and I think like I think the mistake people make is that they're like, okay, well, I've got to check the compliance box. I'm going to publish my hiring range, which we all know is not the whole range. And but then that's when the questions start. And
Yes.
so and if you think that you're in a state or you're somewhere where you don't have to disclose it, it is coming for you. It's coming for everybody, and I think that's a good thing. But I think the reality is the more that others are disclosing and being transparent, the more everyone's going to have to be that way. And we have plenty of clients that do it that aren't required to be in terms of being transparent about all of it.
And so we talked a lot about just the emerging trends, what we're going to be seeing, what we're already seeing, and how hard it's going to be, but the hard work is necessary. So this can be maybe a little overwhelming for someone to think about, oh my gosh, I just have so much to do now, so much to implement. How can they really keep up? I would love to leave the final note with our audience. How can they really keep up with everything that's going on and all the trends that are emerging?
I think one is you know your workforce and you have to trust yourself on that, right? So if this is feeling overwhelming, I think that you have to then say why. What is feeling hard about it and address what feels hard there? Because most organizations are paying people and are set up to have pay programs and they're already in place. So something's holding you back. And so I think it's really trying to identify that and then figuring out what the solve is around it. And if there's a gap from any of these things we've said around doing the hard things or getting started or being unapologetic, really owning that and trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and I would say get going. It's pay transparency shouldn't be an exercise in compliance. It's a tool. And I think it's a tool to help shift culture. It's a tool to help shift engagement. And also, if it's just one less thing that's hard to talk about in the workplace, well, I think that's a win.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us on this conversation, really guiding us and being transparent. It is hard work. So thank you so much for, painting a real picture of what's happening in our world and what's needed to keep up with these trends. So thank you.
Thanks.
So nice to have us.
It was wonderful to have you.
Thanks very much.
If you enjoyed our conversation today, be sure to subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcast so you never miss a new episode. Also, did you know All Things Work is more than a podcast? That's right, we're also a weekly newsletter that includes in-depth articles and the latest research from SHRM to keep you in the know. Just head to shrm.org/allthingswork to sign up. Plus, follow SHRM on social media to view the latest clips and join the conversation on game-changing topics that are redefining the world of work.
SHRM.